All right, we're going to continue on with our tour of the cell here in Chapter 6, finishing out the final section here, Concept 6.7, extracellular components and connections between cells help coordinate cellular activities. Now, most cells synthesize and secrete some type of material that is external to the plasma membrane. This can be a very large structure or a very small structure. Um, the, Probably the easiest way to think about this is actually what the cell wall is in plants. So many prokaryotes, many fungi, and some unicellular eukaryotes, in addition to plants, all have this very thick, complex extracellular material that we call the cell wall. While plants do not have this, they do have something analogous. Now, in plants, these are made up of these things called cellulose fibers, which is essentially just, if you recall from chapter 5, just long strands of glucose linked together in a beta 1,4 configuration. So plant walls can have multiple layers. There's kind of the primary cell wall, which is fairly thin. There's the middle lamina, which occurs in between the cell wall and the adjacent cells. And then in some cases, we even have a secondary cell wall. Now, plants also have these unique structures called plasmodesmata, which actually forms channels that connect one cell to another cell. So let's take a look here. Here we have a plant cell. You can see it has a large vacuole, it has a nucleus, it has chloroplasts, and there are actually little channels that run and connect the cytoplasm of these plant cells. Here, if you look at a close-up of this junction point, you can see a micrograph showing the different layers of cell wall. Now, I said that this is made out of cellulose, which again is just a long chain of glucose. You take these long chains, and because of their beta 1,4 configuration, they can actually cross-link with each other in many ways. So within the strand, it cross-links to each other to adjacent glucose molecules, which makes it fairly rigid and straight, but it also can cross-link across to other fibers. This produces this large region within cellulose that actually has a crystalline structure. And when I mean crystalline, this is not ice, this is actually cellulose crystals in this cup. They organize themselves into these things called microfibrils, which then cluster to form these larger fibrils. These fibrils lay down in crisscrossing fashions, forming mats, and they are cross-linked by other macromolecules such as pectin, building this very large, dense structure. Now, as I said, plants have this, but animals don't, but animal cells do have something called the extracellular matrix, and it is built in a very similar fashion. So it has a collection of largely, instead of carbohydrate sheets, it has these long fibers called collagen that form very long structures, very long fibers that can lay together in mats, much the same way that we see here. And they are also cross-linked to each other with these various other matrix proteins that cross-link it together. So all in all, it has a very similar structure to what we see in the cell walls. Here's another image from the book. You can see the plasma membrane, you can see the microfilament actin filaments forming a net underneath, and then on the outside we have this extracellular matrix linked together. Now, what I want you to understand is this can be very variable in size. So here are two tissues. This first tissue here is epithelial cells. Here you can see an individual cell with its nucleus. You can see this entire tissue, the skin tissue, is made up entirely of cells. Here is connective tissue. These little purple regions are the actual cells. All this pink material is extracellular matrix. So connective tissue, our bones, are largely made up of this extracellular matrix and has very few cells that actually are responsible for laying down this material. So large parts of our body can actually be made up of just this large protein mass. Now, the extracellular matrix can also have a role in the lives of the cell. When you get binding of these extracellular matrix proteins to the proteins in the plasma membranes that bind to it, it actually activates signaling cascades. So there are a lot of cells that you cannot grow in tissue culture unless you first lay down a layer of collagen that can activate these cells to believe that they should live and survive and grow there. We also have junctions occurring between cells. The most prominent of these would be the plasmodesmata within plant cells. Again, this is a plant-specific thing, and you can see them here. They actually form channels from one cell to another cell. So the cytoplasm and several small molecules can actually pass through, even up to the level of proteins and RNA can pass cell to cell. We'll talk about this in more detail when we talk about some issues with plants. Now, all cells, including plants and animals, have other types of junctions within them. So we have these things called tight junctions. This actually pulls together neighboring cells and prevents leakage of fluid through them. So the reason why our internal fluids don't leak out is because it can't get through these tight junctions. There's also various anchoring proteins that form together with a cytoskeleton to link neighboring cells together. And we also have various communication channels that run through our cells. These are far not as profound as the plasmodesmata in plants, but small ions can definitely pass through here, which leads to internal signaling mechanisms being able to pass from one cell to another. So, concept 6.7, the extracellular components and connections between cells help coordinate cellular activities. So we talked about the cell walls in plants, how it's made up of cellulose, forming these ever larger fibrils that get laid down in mats and form a very rigid structure. And it can come into various layers within the plant. We don't have those, but we do have an extracellular matrix, and it's very analogous in nature. It can produce quite a large amount of material. So if you think about connective tissue or bone tissue, most of it is extracellular matrix, not cells. Here we have example of how our cells are linked together here. We can have various tight junctions, which produce watertight leakage, so things can't pass through. We have various things that connect to the cytoskeleton, linking cells together, making them strong. And then we have these gap junctions, which can allow small ions to go through. An even larger version of these gap junctions are found in plants, and they're called plasmodesmata, and are actually continuous membrane bridges or tunnels that can pass from one cell to another. Now, something that I want you to consider is, despite all these concepts looking at all the pieces, Keep in mind that the cell itself is greater than the sum of its parts. So it has all these various activities, but they work together and coordinate large-scale behaviors. And while all of these have a molecular underpinning, let's not lose sight of the fact that the unique nature that cells have.